Che cosa pensa dei classici della letteratura come Pinocchio o Alice in the Wonderland? E possono ancora interessare i bambini di oggi? Oppure i bambini di oggi amano altri romanzi, altri generi di narrativa o di storia?
This is a very difficult one. If you ask the question, if you think of the adolescent books, which actually in the English tradition, that is English North American, goes back to the early 19th century, 1800s, and goes all the way through the 19th century. And if you ask the question, why are there no classics out of that time, except the obvious things like Huckleberry Finn, which was not published for young people at all, it was published as an adult book. But if you think of those that are left, Alice in Wonderland and so on, why are there not more? Because in the adult tradition there are many classics from the 19th century, some of the greatest novels. So were the children's books not good enough to become classics? Why aren't they there? And I think there's a very curious difference between young people's books and the mainstream, which is that young people's books tend to be subject to the fashions of the children themselves. They tend not to read the stuff that's historical, unless they're very keen readers and they have the sort of family which introduces them to them. But very few of the books become classics, and those tend to be studied by adults, not by the children at all. So there's a strange thing about the children's books, and in particular the teenage books, where the readers are always moving on to what is there now for them. It's a kind of temporary literature, which bothers me a little bit, because for instance, in the 19th century in England, a writer who, if he had produced adult novels, I think would have been a classic writer, would have still be read and taught, but he wrote novels about children at school. His name was Talbot Baines Reed, and he wrote a lot of novels for what we would call now teenagers, and they're brilliant. But teenagers don't read them now because it doesn't apply to their lives now. So children don't study literature in the way that the adults do. And so these great books tend to get lost, with very rare exceptions. I mean, in your tradition, Pinocchio, which I wonder how many children still read Pinocchio unless it's absolutely introduced to them. In Alice in Wonderland, our children don't read that unless it's really brought to them, and they find it a rather odd book. There are so many peculiar references that belong to the 19th century that you have to know about to see why it's funny. So there is a problem there, and I do find that disturbing, because I think that what ideally would happen is that adults would remain interested in that literature, not simply as an academic study. It's the academics who keep it alive, you know. The number of critical essays that are written about things like Little Women or Alice in Wonderland are numerous. So they're interested in it as a history. But adult readers, ordinary adult readers, would find a lot of literature that's very entertaining and interesting. I'll tell you a parallel here. And I think that happened here too. The same thing happened here. This is about women's literature. In the 1970s in Britain, a very assertive woman said, why is it that all the great literature we study is written by men, with the exception of people like Jane Austen, George Eliot, who was a woman though she had a man's name. And they published, this was a publishing house called Virago, set up to publish only women's writing, and they recovered books from the 19th century, from the 18th century, that the Academy didn't study anymore. These became hugely popular. They recovered a whole literature. And I think that happened here too. I think, in fact, Giunti did some of this. Now, the same kind of thing needs to happen with the great children's books, with the understanding that they're not only for children to read, that the adults can also get a great deal out of them, not just as an academic study, but as a pleasurable literature to read. So it's a very difficult question, that one. And I find it a bit bothering, because you see some very fine literature disappearing. The one place it doesn't is in the picture book. There are great books established that we go on looking at and go on giving to children. And that's a growing literature. It's in the novel where it doesn't happen.
Thank you, Mr. Chambers.
Grazie.